So it seems to me everyone has taken the seats, and not everyone just fled from here. So thank you so much that you staying here. If I may, I will introduce the participants of the next part of our panel discussion. I'll begin with André Küüsvek, the Director of Local Currency and Capital Markets Development of EBRD. Oleg Serdyuk, who is the Head of Fixed Income and Equities of OTP Bank Ukraine. Konstantin Lykhytsky, Head of Treasury of AXA Insurance. Vladimir Osakovskiy, Russian CIS economist and EEMEA cross-asset strategy and economics of Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and Maxim Libanov, Commissioner of the National Securities and Stock Market Commission. We're having the second part without presentations, in fact. So if I may, I will just ask the questions and each of you can speak on this topic. I will begin with Oleg as a representative of the banking sector, because the banking institutions for today are the biggest financial institutions in comparison with the insurance companies and pension funds, with the assets of approximately more than 1 trillion hryvnia. Oleg, up till 2008, since 2003 to 2008, the market of corporate bonds was a very successful form of funding for the corporate segment. And in fact, including your bank and lots of other Western banks have actively taken part in this segment. But after 2008, the situation has roughly changed. We don't see a single bank as investors into the corporate bonds. In your opinion, what should change, or what's going on now, which could motivate, first of all, the big Western banks to come back to this market, for them to look at the corporate bonds as a tool for the investments? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Well, maybe this answer was already given during the first part of this panel discussion when we were speaking about the state debt, because the state debt is really connected with the corporate debt, and the first start has already been conducted. For today, 95% of the market is the market of domestic government bonds. What has happened during the recent years? Maybe it's connected with the banking crisis which took place, and the banks, and foreign banks including, have looked again at their credit policy. They became more conservative. First of all, that concerns the unsecured debt. And here we have the corporate bonds too. That is why, for the foreign banks, this is more of a kind of a group strategy. And the banks, when they look at the clients, they became more cautious in their choice. What needs to be done to begin the market of the corporate bonds? Out of the practice of the previous years, maybe, we have the experience of the placement in 2002, it seems to me, Kyivstar experience. So it would be nice to begin with certain blue chips. Those are the companies which are well known to the investor and which could really potentially having a nice potential to be placed at the market. What needs to be done there for that? As an option, we need a very nice liquidity of the market and the support of the secondary market. That is why here we need cooperation of the underwriting and organizers of the placement, which would allow for the investors to be sure that it's not just a classical hold to maturity, but it will be the bonds, the market of which will be active enough. Unfortunately, for today, The majority of investors which can be found at the Ukrainian market are banks. But we would like not only banks to be represented, but all the other investors, I mean insurance companies and non-residents, which were mentioned by Vladislav Sachinsky, for them to come to the corporations, the pension funds, the companies on the assets governance. What's it connected with? It's because the banks, the resources of the banks are rather short-term ones. The liabilities of the banks and all of the risks which emerge in the banking system are automatically spread onto the market of bonds. So here, if we have a diversification among investors, it would allow the market to be more liquid and to have the depth of the market. Oleg, thank you so much for your answer. During the previous panel part, we saw that we've discussed almost all of the participants of the new investors which can emerge at the market, both private persons, well, maybe they will not take corporate bonds soon, the insurance companies, we'll mention about them now, but the only ones whom we haven't mentioned are non-residents. So let's listen to Vladimir Osakovskiy. During my previous life, when I placed the bonds, we had lots of placements which have been done up to 2012 by the non-residents. There was a huge demand. After that, the non-residents of the corporate bonds have just vanished. The question for you, how the foreign investors are looking at Ukraine, and are they ready to look at the corporate bonds in Ukraine, how they consider the emitter should look like. And the third point, there was an issue of Ukr-Exim Bank. Those were euro bonds just connected to hryvnia, indexed to hryvnia. So for them, are they ready to enter into the Ukrainian local market, or do they need more bonds according to the English legislation? Well, thank you that you invite me for such a panel discussion. Well, this is not my profile, in fact, but it's a very interesting point, because I think that the investors can be always found. Well, the questions of sales, not sales, this is very relevant here. The profitability is rather good for the investors in the market, where they have the huge amount of debt and negative figures as for profitability. The countries which are paying 20-something%, they're always interesting. So as for the corporate bonds, it's not a taboo. There are certain precedents when the corporate bonds are sold better than the sovereign ones. Recently, the ranking of Russia was lower than the ranking of separate corporate bonds. So looking at Ukraine, I'd say that if we, for instance, look at the long issues of the corporate industries, it can really have much better credit history than the sovereign bonds, because it has its own issues. There is a huge debt there. But as for those structural shifts of the economy, it can also influence separate branches. So to make the external investors interested in the internal market, when we speak about the external investors, there are portfolio investors, the people who are coming not to invest into a certain company, but to get, to win because of the certain decrease of the rate and so on. To attract such investors, they need an opportunity to exit from this tool in any moment, and then the moment the issue of liquidity is becoming the key one. The amount of placement should be of benchmark size. Well, of course, not $500 million, but still be rather substantial in dollars, for us to have the market, for people to come and go, and, of course, then we need to look at the quality of certain creditors. When you said a bit less than $500 million, we can now recalculate that. They can be found, right? I do believe that they exist somewhere.
Хорошо, спасибо большое.
Okay, thank you so
По крайней мере, это оптимистично.
At least this is very optimistic. It's pleasant to hear that investors always exist. So the next investor are the insurance companies. So I'd like to ask the question to Konstantin Lykhytsky. The insurance companies, I communicate with lots of our traders, and I can see that insurance companies and the pension fund are becoming one of the main drivers of the market. And the corporate bonds, they have the biggest amount of questions and demand whether there is something new found. So the question for you is, how do you expect the increase of the demand from the insurance companies? And what can be done with the market for the insurance companies to increase their investments into the corporate bonds? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. As for the dynamics of the domestic government bonds, I would like to drive your attention that the demand has really increased in the segment of the insurance companies. So as for the corporate bonds, we shouldn't expect for that, of course, but we can see that it's finally reviving. We have certain key issues which interfere into this growth. Well, of course, in fact, the limited supply, because this year there were two banking issues and two corporate issues where the insurance companies could use. So the interest so far should be revived from the emitter side. The second issue is the liquidity, because the investment into the corporate bonds is undoubtedly a portfolio investment only. With this tool, well, we cannot do anything. We cannot use it in repo transactions or the governance of the current liquidity to sell it. So the secondary market just does not exist for this tool, or the spreads are sometimes enormous, just ridiculous. And the third point is pricing. When we see the primary placement, so-called pitching, when the client is ready to pay the rate approximately equal to the domestic government bond. So all of the placements of the banking sector were at the level lower than domestic government bonds. In this case, it was not an advantage during the investment into the securities. Then, of course, if we mention about different aspects, we have for us, the insurers, the corporate bonds, which are just the replacement of deposits. But again, we do not see any interest from the banking center to issue bonds. So here, maybe, it would be interesting for us if we saw the level of domestic government bonds. But here we can see that the sentiment is changing in the market, and lots of companies of the banking sector are ready to pay those rates, which are approximately equal to domestic government bonds. What then can be interesting for the insurers? And we know that the banks claim accreditation deposits, and if partly those deposits could be transformed into the bonds, which would be a win-win situation for the bank and for the insurance company, we would see the increase of the sums of money in this segment and the growth of this direction. Because if you paid attention at the presentation of Alexander, the investment of the insurance companies into the corporate markets is stagnating. And this is the overall picture. But if I can add, if you paid attention to the assets of the insurance companies which are increasing, I would say about the regulator that the new provision introduces the norm of the capital requirement, and maybe the new money come into this market. Theoretically, hypothetically, the insurance company can invest up to 30% of their reserves into the corporate debt and 10% into one enterprise separately. So the amount of the ticket is comprehensible, right? It is comparable to domestic government bonds. I've got more questions, but before asking you, I could see that several times we mentioned the word liquidity. All of the three answers included liquidity in their answers. So I have the question for André Küüsvek.
The liquidity is the key for the markets. You have a very, I would say, very strong experience working at the EBRD and developing markets and helping to develop capital markets in emerging markets. Do you know how we can increase liquidity in Ukrainian markets? Do you have examples of success stories of emerging markets, how they develop their liquidity? Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan, and great to be back to Ukraine. When I first saw the headline for this panel, including the word liquidity, which I think has now been taken away, I was actually thinking that it's appropriate for the sovereign bonds, but in my view is not appropriate for the corporate bonds, because the corporate bond market globally, 99% of the corporate bonds issued are illiquid, full stop. They just don't trade in the secondary market. They perhaps, after issuance, trade for a week or two, where investors settle their positions depending on how much of their initial bid they achieved through the subscription. But what is more important, I think, is the primary market liquidity. And what I mean here is the repeat issuance. I think, the fact that the same issuers will come back with new issues, either tapping to the previous bond or issuing new bonds, and gradually, perhaps the bigger and better ones develop a yield curve for themselves. I think that is really what matters. And when we talk about terminology here, then obviously when we talk about corporate bonds, then the capital market terminology is such that it's any private sector bond, i.e. non-sovereign bond. So effectively 80% or even more of the global corporate bond market is in fact bank issuance. So banks are big players. The liquidity in the secondary market is only relevant for these bonds that are repo eligible, because you would normally issue bonds for long-term financing, and the long-term investors are usually pension funds and insurance companies, mostly life insurance companies. When I looked at the numbers here, the figures of the first panel, then I was thinking, how do I visualize the depth of the institutional investor base in Ukraine? And it doesn't look good, to be honest. Let me try to illustrate it for you. So what is that I have here? 30 hryvnias, correct. So this is what the pension funds have invested in the bond market of Ukraine per capita. So each of you has invested just about €1. And if one of you invested €1,000, that means the other 999 people didn't invest anything. So that's not very much, right? Unfortunately for the insurance market, I have only foreign currency because I couldn't get 165 hryvnia. So I have €5 is the amount that the insurance companies have invested in the bond market. That's not a lot. And I think there are several problems for it and the reasons why it's not happening. One is the confidence towards, I should call it towards the system, but it includes the capital market infrastructure. There was a previous panel here earlier talking about the trading and post-trading systems, the clearing and settlement, which I think is crucial to integrate properly and have one depository in place, and including also then the depository having links to the international market. So the CSD, either Clearstream or Euroclear or any other mechanism that then brings foreign investors to the market. It also, the confidence to the system includes legal system. And in Ukraine, the laws tend to amend themselves every now and then. So again, this month in September, there was a law draft 9035 being submitted to Rada, Securities Market Law Amendment, which has some positive elements like bondholders' rights, which we have been much supporting and helping to develop these clauses through technical assistance. It has certain elements for the hedging, which are relevant for the foreign investors. But whilst the law is in process of being changed, it's very difficult to act either as a serious investor into Ukraine or, in case of EBRD, to issue local currency bonds. So I would leave it at this for the time being.
Okay, thank you. Я сейчас хотел бы передать слово
I would like to give the floor to Maxim Libanov. Of course, we've got more questions for all of you, to have a speech, to have time for the speech. Maxim, I've got the following question for you. We were just speaking about the new law. So in fact, we need to say that a year ago, I would say a bit less, in November last year, there was a different law adopted which had certain changes into the law on the securities, the law number 2210, which I tried to study it in details. In my opinion, if I compare it to the EU directive, it is a kind of a similar directive for the EU on prospect legislation. This legislation has seriously changed the process of bond issue. And according to my estimations, it has become more expensive both for the public issues, and it has made the emitter's life much harder. And you were one of the authors of this document. Why? Why did you do that? And what's the value added to the people, to the investors who are sitting here and for us? Well, I'm not asking about myself, but still. What's the essence? Why? Yes, it happened. I have to repent myself. Yes, it happened. No, if seriously, the law 2210, among all the other aims which it faced, one of the aims was, in fact, to bring the practice of the public placement of the securities, both bonds and shares, in accordance with the European standards. And of course, we did not invent a wheel, we just took the certain prospects regulations and prospects directives of the EU, and in Ukrainian, of the Ukrainian legislator language, we wrote all of that on the paper. Undoubtedly, of course, we really understood that as the result of those actions, the public placement, or if we use the new terminology, public proposal of securities will become harder. But the answer on the question, why did we do that, is in the speeches of the previous speakers, who said about the transparency and trust. So for the investor to bring money and to invest into security, he or she needs to understand where he or she invests, he should understand the risk, and for the sake of which he's doing that, or what he's doing that. So in fact it brings us to the point when the emitter, or the person who's making this public placement, because according to the new law it could be not even the emitter, he should take a big volume of information to gather this information about the security which is in this public offering. So of course in this part the process has become more complicated, but still with this law 2210 and further regulations and laws which have developed by the Commission and have been adopted and justified, we tried to forgive what we used to name private placement, and now we just say that it's named emission of securities. So we took away the bureaucracy connected with the certain registration of the documents given to the Commission. You shouldn't prepare now the prospects of the emission of the securities, and the part of the documents, for instance, of the financial reports can be shouldn't be given to the Commission, but it should be incorporated into the decision of the Commission through the website link, if it's publicly available. So we have a certain element of paperless then. And if we say what else we are doing, in fact, we are living according to two principles. The first principle, as for the public placement, the prospect of the securities should contain all the necessary information for the average investor to be able to take the investment decision. The principle which was in the law 2210 and which will be required from the potential subjects who will make the public offerings. We are not interested in the risks which will happen after the placement of such a security. We are not interested in the fairness of the profits or revenues. Our task is to provide the potential investor to be able to take the proper decision. This is the first point. And secondly, when we're speaking about the non-public offering, we do understand, as it does not have a retail, and mostly it's done privately between the emitter and the qualified investor, then the Commission does not have any point to regulate this process or to have certain harsh requirements for this process. Then we are weakening those requirements, they are making them not that serious. Thank you so much. I will not ask you how you're planning to define the average investor and his intellectual capabilities, but still. The question number one, André has mentioned that liquidity, the primary liquidity, I'd say, is created by rather placements. So does the Commission plan in any way to simplify the legislation for at least huge emitters, for them to quickly get to the market with the help of the programs, for me to register the program, for instance, Kyivstar. If it wants to attract money or Naftogaz, I'd like to get to the market on a permanent basis, or the banks, the biggest emitters. For Oleg, after registering the program, he could exit it according to the simplified program. So it should be the separate one for the banks. Could you create it for the separate program for the banks, and a possibility to issue securities, understanding that the banks are disclosing even more information than it's foreseen by the law 2210, for them to publish their reports on a daily basis with all of the stakeholders, and the National Bank as a very harsh regulator when it conducts the overview. Well, oversight. Yeah, of course, we do understand that there is or can be a need of the huge emitters to come to the market regularly. So we have already regulated it in the legislation. We have introduced the concept of the basic prospect, which foresees that the emitter is coming to the Commission once, registers the basic prospect and approves it at the Commission. It has all the key information about the emitters, about all of his risks, corporate governance and all the rest. And after the approval of this basic prospect, the emitter, according to the simplified procedure, during the short terms of 10 days, can any time during a year since the moment of the registration of the prospect, can come to the Commission, register final terms for the issue which he'll do at this moment. And those final terms can be as much as the emitter needs. 2, then 2, 100, then 100. It's never restricted, it's never limited. So we are speaking that the emitter has a kind of an unlimited resource in any moment of the time to come to the Commission and, according to the simplified procedure, to get the tool for the public placement. Thank you so much. I see André wanted to ask a question, please.
Well, not a question really, but I wanted to say that this issuance program is very important, because the cost to the issuer is not just the financial cost, but it's also the time cost, right? And many of the big repeat issuers have set up programs, like EBRD, for instance. This month in Turkey, we have issued lira bonds at least twice a week. So it just keeps coming, and this also helps a lot with the price discovery that was mentioned here by one of the colleagues, which is very highly relevant for the investors. That the investors would need to know, look, am I investing at the right price? How does this bond, is it priced towards the government bond yield curve? How is it priced to money market if it's a floating rate and so on? And I think these benchmarks are really crucially important. One other aspect, if I may, which has to do also with the cost of issuance. To issue a bond often is more expensive than to do a loan, particularly when you do a small size. That is something that the policymakers are tackling in Europe. They have, the new prospectus directive, helping the SMEs to tap the market and so on. We did 2 years ago a transaction cost study where we checked in 10 different markets of EBRD, what would it cost to issue a 10 million euro small bond. And we ended up with surprising results that, we figured out that, for instance, in Romania, issuing the same 10 million euros worth of local currency bond was 8 times more expensive than in Hungary. And we brought that up with regulators, stock exchanges, etc. And that included all costs, registration costs, listing costs, legal costs, and so on, rating and so on. And a lot of things were changed, and the bond markets really took off. So we are now a regular investor as EBRD into corporate bonds in Poland, Romania, Turkey, Greece. Closer to Ukraine, we have also invested in Armenia in 2 corporate bonds over the past 10 months, as well as in Kazakhstan. So, once you get the cost down and price discovery to the confidence of investors, then good things will happen. I think there is enough issuance space, both in the corporate sector, enterprises, banks as well, but also municipalities in Ukraine.
Thank you. Вопрос к Олегу.
Thank you. The question for Oleg. When you answered, you mentioned that it would be nice to issue blue chips. When we're speaking about blue chips, whom do you mean? Does the Ukrainian market have the company which could be named blue chips? If me, as an underwriter, if I come there and I could say, yes, we're ready to have this credit committee and it would be interesting. Yes, sure, I think that lots of us would be able to name them, to list them, because I think the most popular is the agrarian sector. Out of the agrarian sector, we can see the Kernel and NHP. Those are the companies which are known, well-renowned, who don't need money. Well, so far. As an emitter, they have an example to placement abroad, experience to of the placement abroad. Why shouldn't they do that in Ukraine? And as for the state-owned companies, well, it's not that easy because, in fact, I already mentioned that foreign banks have the group policy, and lots of them are working, and some of them are not working, in the state sector, because the state sector is a separate part. Then the question, you've mentioned, in fact, the companies which are working with the dollar revenue, so hryvnia funding for lots of those companies. So, okay, if we look at the dollar bonds inside Ukraine, would it be interesting, or it's just we are speaking about the totally irrelevant topic? Well, we know that now, as for the dollar liquidity of the banks, it is excessive. So in theory, if we had internal dollar corporate bonds, they would be really demanded. So theoretically only. The law on currency allows everything. Unfortunately, the question from the audience is without the mic. So if we speak about the laws in the law on the securities at the capital market, it can be both in the foreign currency. Yes, both laws foresee that the corporate emitter can have the placement on the territory of Ukraine in foreign currency, and everything is done in the currency, in the foreign currency then. I can show you the quote in the law. I don't see a big difference between the credit loan in the dollars and bonds in the dollars. So this is not the tool of payment. Yes, it's not the tool of payment. So coming back to the question of liquidity, Konstantin, when we are speaking about the investment of the insurance companies, of the state bonds, to some extent, this is not a risk-free still. This is an investment which needs not that complicated credit analysis. So when you invest into the insurance companies and corporate bonds, we are facing the credit risks, which, as for the insurance companies, this is not their main activities to assess their credit risks. What do you think about the insurance sector? Is it ready? Your colleagues, because I know that you invested a lot, but your colleagues, as a sector as it is it ready to assess credit risks? Or still, this is the way which needs to be done? Let's still segment that, because the corporate bonds is a bit too broad notion. So I would first separate bank bonds, and then this credit is much more comprehensible, and we really assess it at the level of the deposit, and the insurance companies are ready to have the same means in the different tool with the similar qualities. Then I would say about the quasi-state ones, when we saw the issues of Ukrainian post office and Ukrainian railways and so on. And then I would speak about the market of real economy. But here we need the support of underwriters, we need the support of the name of the bank which will take this corporate to the market here. Because unfortunately, the work of the high-ranking agencies even now leaves much to be desired. If you look now at the ranking of the banks, you wouldn't surely find the bank with the ranking less than AA, which is an investment ranking in the top 40 of the banking system. Thank you. The ranking agency, I mean Ukrainian agencies, again, is a separate topic for conversations. Yes, but regulators quote them, and they're compulsory, those ranking agencies. Oh, I can tell you for a long time how it was introduced and what our position was, but we're not speaking about that. The question to André. EBRD
in investing in local bonds. Local corporate bonds in different markets in Poland, as I remember, in Hungary, and other. If we exclude the question of funding of EBRD in hryvnia, do you think that it is possible that EBRD once will be able to invest in corporate bonds, and if there is any sense to do that, to be an anchor investor for example, for first issuers, to give it more attractive, to make them more attractive for other investors?
Well, certainly yes. We would be interested to develop the bond market here, and therefore we would also be willing to take the risk. However, we would not like to mix the credit risk with the currency risk. So therefore it's very difficult to eliminate the FX element out of it. So we have to be able to fund ourselves in hryvnias in order to invest in hryvnias, be it in form of loans or bonds, it doesn't even matter. So the answer is yes. We have been doing that in various other countries, in various other products. It's not just the senior bonds we are talking about here, but we have done also infrastructure bonds. More recently in Turkey, for instance, in Merrill International Port, we have done covered bonds in the past 6 months alone in 5 different countries. We have done green in various countries and so on and so forth. So there are many different products where, in fact, the Ukrainian issuers could tap a very specific investor base that perhaps would not be even interested in, in something different. But if there is a covered bond investor base or there is an infra bond investor base, they would be perhaps something that they would be willing to look at. But they will never mix the credit risk with the currency risk.
Okay, thank you. Actually, мы подходим уже к концу по времени.
So we're coming closer to the end. As for the time, I would like to ask the question for Oleg and Konstantin.
Вопрос, который мы обсуждали off-topic за пределами этой панели, мы сталкивались с такой вещью, как защита прав инвесторов.
The protection of the investors' rights, and we can see that the Commission is doing a lot and adopts lots of additional law drafts, laws in the Parliament which improve those tools. So, in your opinion,
защита прав инвесторов.
The investors' rights protection. Do you have any questions for the bonds tools as they are? Do we have any improvements which need to be done for the investors' rights to be protected in a better way? Or when we speak about the protection of the investors' rights, this is still the issue of the investment climate of Ukraine. And the tool itself is not under doubts. Well, yes, really, this is a very painful issue, so I think that it should be considered as the private case of an overall one. Still, this is the component of the investors' rights protection, because we need to have the positive and successful story about the investment attractiveness, and only after that we'll say that in this case, in this particular case, as for the bonds, everything is okay too. Well, I will make it more precise then. We were looking at the prospects with covenants, filling them with covenants. Is there a sense of that? Or maybe it's connected with the law enforcement system, with the courts, and with the legislation about bankruptcy. So when we're speaking about the tools, when we're speaking about the rights protection, we need to develop it, or we should emphasize more on what's done in this sphere more. André, maybe you want to speak about that.
I mean, we don't expect the Ukrainian judiciary system to suddenly, turn from one page to the other and improve drastically. But there are some even technical aspects. One needs to understand that being a bond issuer ties you up a lot more. I mean, you actually, from the day one to the redemption, you have to obey the rules. If you take a loan from a bank and you can't repay it, you walk to your bank and say, sorry, не получилось. Что мы можем делать? You can't go to your 2,000 bondholders and have the same unless the securities market law actually prescribes how does the bondholder assembly take place, what sort of majority is needed to make these decisions, etc. And that's what is missing at the moment. And once we have that, I think it's a big step. It's a technicality, but it matters.
Thank you.
Well,
I can help commenting upon that. André, thank you that you raised the issue of the bondholders and the meetings. Because the Commission, with the help of the EBRD, of course, has developed that already. Those necessary amendments at the level of the law, which would make this construction compulsory. But what we've done this year, without waiting for the Parliament to pay attention to the legislation of the capital market, in the regulations about the emission and the corporate bonds, we foresaw that the emitter can take as an additional
предусмотреть как дополнительную ковенанту, хотя это не совсем ковенанта,
но
предусмотреть в проспекте порядок проведения такого бondхолдер-митинга и, соответственно, предусмотреть, какую компетенцию он надаст на решение облигационеров, и так далее. То есть мы фактически пытаемся коль законодатель пока не доходит, нормативно указать или подсказать эмитентам, что вот, смотрите, вот здесь вот может быть для вас очень интересный способ решения массы вопросов.
Thank you so much, Oleg. Yes, I'd like to add what I'd like to say. Still, we see the development of the investors' rights protection through the covenants of the prospect of the emission, and secondly, what Konstantin has mentioned, still this is the reputation of the underwriter himself and the emitter, first of all. Those are the things which, for today, as a potential investor, we pay attention to that. Konstantin, a short remark, please. I do understand as for the investors' rights protection, but I would look at the underwriter, at the depth of support. What will be the bid then? And the depth of this bid. If it is totally acceptable by me, then it will be the sign of the loan quality. Are there any questions here?
Dmitry Zolotko,
Укргазбанк. This year, besides several emissions by the banks and corporate clients, we had 2 more issues of the municipal ones. Maybe this is the first time for the 6 years Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk joined the market with the municipal issues, and as far as I know, several more municipalities are looking at the opportunity of this issue. So I'd like to ask Oleg, André and Konstantin whether there is an interest of the bank and insurance companies and EBRD to buy municipal bonds, and if you have such an interest, which bonus to the sovereign would you see then?
Well, as EBRD, we have invested in a few municipal bond issues. In fact, helping them to come up with the issuance plan, proper structure. In Bucharest, in Romania, for instance, we helped them to do 3, 5, 7, and 10-year tranches. In Zagreb as well, Croatia. So that is something that we see, very much useful also for the municipalities, because they will guarantee their funding over a long period of time. They will normally have long-term projects anyway, and to match their assets with liabilities, I think it's a great idea. We would like to be in it.
Yes, really, we looked at the issue of the municipal bonds, and again, we came back to the liquidity and depth of the market. As far as we don't have any answers for those basic questions, to have any credit analysis of the municipalities themselves, there is no sense to do that. Unfortunately, we cannot equalize the municipalities and the government bonds. This is the different credit history. And as for the insurance market, we are not ready to conduct such a loan analysis. We know the past, and we have learned certain lessons out of the past. So far, as Oleg has mentioned, this is the same story. Liquidity, the development of the secondary market, and if we see that this is really the one which exists, of course, undoubtedly, we are ready to use this tool.
One small remark, that the municipal bonds would have to be in local currency in a country like Ukraine. There is no point. In fact, in many Western European countries, it's prohibited to the municipalities to borrow in any foreign currency, full stop.
Thank you. Are there any other questions left? Yes, I can see the hand. Hello, my name is Sergey. I'm from the company of Hacks. Do you want to name the toast? To say the toast? Well, I'd like to, but still. If the answer is not what I'm expecting, then I'm ready to drink with you. So, I'm sorry. The question is the following. Lots of the presentees remember what happened with the corporate issues during 2008 and 2009. Lots of people remember the wonderful emitters like Caravan and the alcohol Crimean producer. I don't remember the name. You do remember, thank you. So, lots of the speakers and the organizers of this forum used to be speaking and said that the corporate bonds market has perished if we don't protect the investors' protection, provide the investors' protection for those who... So, I'm in a bit different market, but I would like to ask you, has anything changed? And if not, what's the point of this panel discussion then? Thank you. Thank you for this question. I would try to answer this question. I would say that we are all trying to make the changes. And as it was mentioned by Konstantin, really, since the beginning of the year, if we remember the development of the market since 2001 to 3, there were several emitters and banks which took a decision that we'll make it. ICU, which we represent, we took a decision that we will do that. I personally take part in lots of the working groups about the development of legislation, and if you remember what was the prospect of the emission in 2001, it was the information on the securities emission issue, and it took the 4 pages. And now to write the prospect of the emission, according to the previous legislation, it was about it took 40 to 50 pages. So according to the new legislation, it would take approximately 150 pages now. Of course, it's one of the elements, one of the components of the investors' rights protection, the transparency. So of course, if you don't have the court system and law enforcement system working, even if you have, for instance, the tractors coming from one point to the destination point, they will not reach this destination point, even if you have bonds and securities, security deposits. So when we calculated, when I used to work at a different place, I will not advertise it now, we calculated the losses on the portfolio of securities, the level of its default, and it was lower than the average indicator at the banking system. I don't know how it used to be, for instance, at Oleg's or Konstantin's, whether they had such an analysis conducted. And also I was interested, maybe there is a kind of an agency, credit ranking, and one of the useful functions was the report since 2007 to 2011 with the statistics of default. So selecting the companies, I remember the level of default was not higher than 20-25%, if I remember correctly. I'm sorry, what's the problem then? Why do we have the loans but we don't have corporate bonds? That is why we're having this panel discussion, and we want to understand how to bring the investors back to the market, and still 25% is a bit too much. Yes, I'd like to comment upon that, Sergey. I would remind you again that I told you that the corporate bonds is the peculiar case of the common problem of the investors' rights protection. You're totally right. And what you told, it also concerns the banking loans, bank loans. As for statistics, no, we don't have the default statistics. What's the ratio? But still, I'd like to tell you that after the change of the loan policy of the bank, I can tell you about my bank. My share of the unsecured loans in the portfolio is less than 10%, including the overdrafts and all the rest products, which are, according to their nature, are unsecured. So, of course, the conclusions were made. And now we're saying that we still need to move on and to protect somehow the investors' rights. There are certain cases which ended up how you told, but there are certain cases which ended up really not bad just recently. There was the deal with a Arabic country about the big corporate loan, so there are lots of different options. Unfortunately, without the microphone, we don't hear the question.
Просто вопрос в чем, как бы, что
The
если
question is
был
the
когда-то был
following.
высокий уровень дефолтов,
When
у
we
нас есть
had
две
the
опции.
high level
Просто
of
сказать,
default,
что
we
давайте
had
больше
two
мы ничего не будем
options.
делать, можем дальше
First of all,
закрыть
let us not do
кредитование,
anything. We
обидеться
can
на
speak
рынок,
about the
сказать,
credits. We can
55%
just be
уровень дефолтности в банковской
angry
системе,
with the
который до
market
сих пор в
and
НБЛ.
would say that this
Наверное, давайте
50%
перестанем
level
кредитовать, пока мы не
shouldn't
решим
exist.
все
Let's stop
проблемы
giving
защиты
loans
прав
until we
инвесторов.
don't solve all of the issues with their investors' rights protection. Or we can still try to do something for this market to be developed. And my experience tells me that if we don't do anything but just theorizing this topic, we won't achieve anything. We are trying to issue bonds. We are trying, not only trying, but we are issuing bonds. We are supporting the quotations. We are selling them to our portfolio. We are trading them, and we cannot deal with that on our own. That is why we are raising the question: what should be done further on? How to develop this market? We have the banks which are developing the municipal market. Those are Oshad Bank and Ukrgas Bank, which borrowed two issues of the municipal bonds. So we do hope that after the market of government bonds, we'll have the corporate bonds market.
Спасибо большое. Я больше
So
не
thank you
хотел бы
so
стоять
much.
между
I
вами
would like
и
to stand
ужином.
between
Я
you
хотел сделать
and
небольшое
the
объявление.
dinner. I'd like to make a short announcement.
Нет, панель будет просто она не в этом зале, а она
There will be a
опциональна,
different
как вы
panel,
хотите.
and
Я
it's
хотел бы сделать небольшое
optional. That's
объявление, что
why I'd
начиная
like
с
to make an announcement.
6:30
Since
будет
6:30,
действовать трансфер
there will be the
от отеля
transfer
«Борисполь».
from the hotel.
Он погасил облигации, кстати.
By the way, Borispil
От
has
отеля «Бристоль» в ресторан,
had the
и
bonds.
шаттлы будут
So,
отправляться
Bristol
по мере
Hotel
наполнения и
to the
где-то в
restaurant.
течение 2 часов. Поэтому
You'll have the shuttle
мы ждем вас
buses.
еще на следующей
So we
панели.
are
Кто
waiting
хочет
for you
прийти,
for
кто
at the
хочет,
next
может
panel.
уже
If you want, you can join us in
расслабиться.
the
Можем еще
second
пообщаться в
hall.
кулуарах.
Or we
Я
can
буду с удовольствием
communicate
отвечу
with
на
you,
на
or you can
вопросы.
relax
Уж
already.
твои,
I'll
Сергей.
gladly answer your questions, including your
Спасибо большое,
questions,
что вы
Sergey.
присутствовали.
Thank you
Большое
so
спасибо.
much for being here.